Good evening, everybody. Really glad to be with you. I'm Rabbi Daniel Berg. I'm one of the rabbis here at Beth Am Synagogue, together with my colleague Rabbi Tyler Dratch, who's over there at the back table. Welcome to Beth Am. Beth Am is a nearly 50-year-old synagogue in a just over 100-year-old synagogue building. So it's always been a synagogue in a neighborhood which has shifted and grown and evolved over the years. We're invested in this community. We strive to be in, for, and of this neighborhood, but also involved in deep and important justice work throughout Baltimore City and beyond, which brings us to our topic this evening. So I wanted to say a word. Rabbis teach Torah, that's what we do. So I wanted to mention something from the Torah portion that's coming this Shabbat, which is we're reading from Parshat Yitro, which is the Torah portion that includes the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20. There's a lot to say, obviously, about the 10 Commandments, and one thing we might focus on is the 5th commandment to honor our parents, kibud av v'em in Hebrew. And a lot of times we give thought to what we owe our parents as children, sometimes as young children thinking about our parents, but also as grown children thinking about our parents and our obligations to the previous generation. I think we spend sometimes less time focused on our obligations to younger generations. But there's actually something that indicates how we might think about our obligation to the next generation in the 2nd commandment. Jews and Christians break down the commandments a little differently, but for us, the 2nd commandment begins with saying that we are not worshiping idols, right? That we should have no other gods before God. And then we go into specifics. We shouldn't worship these idols. And then there are some consequences that are kind of laid out for this. And it's a little strange, but the text tells us that God will punish those who are not loyal, those who are not listening unto the 3rd and the 4th generation. But those who follow the mitzvot and demonstrate fealty to God are rewarded until the 1000th generation. So if you think about this sort of prescriptively about God, it's a hard text, right? We don't like the idea of a vengeful God. I don't like the idea of a vengeful God. But if we think about it descriptively, if we think about the impact of generational trauma and how behaviors in one generation impacts the next and the next and the next, then we begin to see how actually our responsibility to the next generation is in our hands, right? We can work together to ensure that for 1,000 generations there'll be better and better outcomes, or we can ignore the work that we need to do and participate in the passing down of mistakes that lead to the compounding of mistakes by the state, by the government, and by our legal system. We don't want to do that. Tonight we're going to learn about how to do better. And here's the last thing I want to say. I'm a parent of 2 children. I've made plenty of mistakes along the way. One thing that I've learned along the way is that the best gift that we can give to our children is to enable them to become healthy adults. I've got one off in Portland, Oregon, trying to do that. I'm really proud of her. I've got another who's here in Baltimore, a sophomore at Baltimore School for the Arts, who's doing great as well. But when I think about my kids, what I really want is for them to become excellent, healthy, thriving, productive, loving, nurturing adults. And the best way, paradoxically, that we can allow our children to become great adults is to let them be kids when they're kids, and to not pretend that they're adults, right? The only way we get to making good choices as adults is giving ourselves time to make some bad choices as kids. Now, sometimes there are really bad choices, and there are consequences to those choices. But we need to treat our children as children. We do that, we're taking a step in the right direction of enabling us, and hopefully God, for the next generation to be maybe a little better and not worse than this one. So with that, I want to turn it over to our panel. and thank them very much for being here this evening for, I'm sure, a wonderful night of important learning.
Good evening. Good evening. It's great to be here. My name is Nate Bayless. We're all going to introduce ourselves before we get into this. Thank you, Rabbi. I don't have to go to shul on Saturday now. I've learned a new lesson. I think we're all thrilled to be here with you to talk about something that's really, really important. I want to thank vaDor for hosting us and for Jews United for Justice for calling all of us to action, calling our communities to action. One of the more important lessons I learned as a young person going through my own time in Hebrew school and through my teenage years is obviously the importance of tikkun olam, that we all need to help repair the world. And we have a broken justice system. And it's been that way a long time, and it's particularly that way when it comes to how we treat young people. And so I think that's why we're here. And so I'm looking forward to tonight, and we're going to have a lot to say about that. So real quick, I'll introduce myself. So I am the director of the Juvenile Justice Strategy Group at the Annie Casey Foundation. The Annie Casey Foundation is right here in Baltimore in Mount Vernon, but we work nationally. And the focus of the Annie Casey Foundation is to build brighter futures for all young people. And because we focus on brighter futures for all young people, for the last 3 decades, the Annie Casey Foundation has focused on juvenile justice reform. And juvenile justice reform mainly has meant about keeping young people out of detention centers, keeping them out of our correctional facilities, and keeping them out of adult jails and prisons. And whenever we can, keeping them out of the juvenile justice system altogether. As Rabbi Berg was talking about, I myself, I have a 13-year-old. We're about to have bar mitzvah in 4 weeks. It's a little crazy in my house right now. And when we look at our own young people in our lives, it's kind of impossible to imagine what the juvenile justice system does to young people. It's impossible to imagine them and not think of them as having brighter futures. And even if they made mistakes, as Rabbi Berg said, we would expect great things from them. I know I do for my 2 boys. So that's how I got involved in this myself in the first place, and I'm glad that I work in a place that understands that if we want brighter futures for all young children, for all children in this country, that means young people who are in the juvenile justice system. It means when kids make mistakes. It means when kids break the law. It even means when kids harm other people, that we still believe in their future and we work towards a future. And when we do that, it's good for all of us. Real quick, I'll say I served in the last few years, I served on Maryland's Juvenile Justice Reform Council, which is the basis of a law that passed a couple of years ago, the Juvenile Justice Reform Act, which has gotten a lot of attention, and that some of you may have heard in the news. And as we come into this new legislative session, seems to be one that is going to get even more attention. And I think I'm very proud of that, of being part of that commission. And I know we'll talk about this tonight, but in part because of, again, the values that were under that, which was not just about young people, but about protecting public safety, using data and research to guide our decisions, which is rare in public policy that we have the opportunity to do that, to be very deliberate about how we do things, not just react to something that happens in the news yesterday, but go through a process that brings together people from both political parties and brings in researchers and advocates and people with experience. And that's what we did. So I was really proud of that. And probably one of the proudest things I've done in my career over the last 20 plus years in juvenile justice. So from there, I'm going to pass the mic around. I'm going to start to my right with Willie Hamilton. And Willie, why don't you introduce yourself, and then we'll go on from there.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Willie Hamilton. I'm a formerly incarcerated person who served 30 years, 110 days, and I was incarcerated at the age of 16. Currently, I've been home for 19 months, and I'm involved with reentry and prison advocacy. Quick introduction.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Gordon Pack. I'm Incarcerated Children's Advisory Network, and I want to mention that because this is a subgroup of the Campaign for Fair Sentencing of Youth. And what it consists of, membership, are young people who actually went to prison, were adjudicated as adults, and served substantial time in prison systems across the state. As young as 14 and served as much as 53 years. But we are released, and we're trying to do community service to try to help and prevent other people from going through that. In addition to that, I'm a parole advocate for a beautiful organization called Prepare. It's one of the only organizations that exists in Maryland that focuses solely on parole advocacy and education. I'm also involved in a number of coalitions dealing with juvenile justice and criminal justice reform. And my motto for this particular session is, the more you know, the better decisions you can make.
Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Natasha Darty, Maryland State Public Defender, and I'm really pleased and honored to be here this evening. I have been in the role of State Public Defender since July 1st of 2022, but I have served the people of Maryland as a public defender for approximately, what is it, 2024? Gosh, since 1996. So I have been a public defender for almost 30 years because I believe in the work, I believe in the advocacy, I believe in the work that we do in terms of amplifying the voice of the marginalized throughout Maryland. But in addition to being a public defender, one of my most important jobs is that I'm a mom of two incredibly just kind and just brilliant human beings. I have a 19-year-old who is a sophomore at College Park, and that's my son, and I have a daughter who is a second-year law student at the University of Georgia.
Hi, I'm Vinny Schiraldi. I am the Secretary of the Department of Juvenile Services. Tomorrow is my 1-year anniversary, so I'm hoping but I've been in the field for 44 years, since 1980, and when dinosaurs roamed the earth. And I've run juvenile justice for Washington, D.C., probation for adults and juveniles in New York City, and for 7 horrible months, Rikers Island in New York City. And being around for 44 years, which is a really decent or indecent chunk of mass incarceration in America, I've seen moral panics before, and I think we all need to sort of, in a room full of people who are faith-based and who believe in social justice, I think we ought to put our sniffers up for some of what's going on right now. It's starting to feel a lot like some of the panics I've seen over the years when kids were called super predators and vilified by people in both parties. And very, very bad public policy came from that didn't have much to do with public safety, but had a lot to do with locking a lot of black boys up, and men, and women too. And I think we just, part of what I hope we can have some dialogue about today is where we are with that, and how we, as people of faith and as people who care about social justice, address that.
So great. So we're going to just get into it, and I'm going to ask questions of the panel, sometimes for everyone on the panel, sometimes directed at individuals, and then we'll have time to take questions from all of you. So I hope you have lots of questions. This should be a really good conversation. So I'm just going to get into it right where Vinny started. So we're in an environment tonight where juvenile crime is often the focus of the evening news. The stories, the language, the focus on black youth in particular in Baltimore, as Vinny said, echoes the 1990s in a big way. So I want to ask, I'm going to start from this side with Willie, how do media narratives about crime impact efforts to make the juvenile justice system more fair and improve public safety? So why don't we start, just an easy one, just like that. Why don't I throw it to you, and then we'll dance around.
So when you look at the media today involving juvenile crime, it does nothing to help juvenile reform or to create policies that are catered to those who are juveniles. It does the opposite. You hear the tough on crime, you hear that we need to do something with them, instead of looking for a solution to this problem. We see it all the time, whether it's carjackings, robberies, thefts. We have to look for a solution. Locking them up, throwing away the key, has never been a solution. We looked at that during the 90s, the 80s. This was never a solution.
Well, let me begin with a short story. Not too long ago, outside of my house, the neighbors banged on the door and asked if that was my car out front. The window was busted, the doors was open, and lights, everything was flashing on the car. My initial reaction was, I thought about children. That was my initial reaction because this is what we always see. So in my mind, I was upset with every kid that was in the neighborhood. I wanted something done. I wanted them to pay. And in my mind, I said, we need to call the police. They need to get locked up. They need to go to jail. That's what I was thinking. Now, after I got over it a little bit, I realized I used to do the same thing. So how can I take this position about children who are just joyriding, have no concept of the loss that people incur when these things take place? But it comes primarily from the media. It comes from what we hear and what we see every day. And the reality is, once you check the statistics is not always juveniles. But we just go there. But the weird thing is, 3 weeks later in another neighborhood, same exact thing happened. Coming back from a conference where I was talking, and kids they just broke my window as I got there, and they started walking off. And I'm like, what do I do? But this tells you that in some cases, there are children that's getting involved in this. In other cases, they aren't. So I believe that the media puts a false front out there. We're trying to blame the kids. We're trying to get people terrified of kids because they want a specific action to take place. It's sensationalism, and if we can prove that it's the kids, we should treat them just like the adults. And that's not how it's supposed to be.
So just to get this out of the way, because I think it just needs to be said, I think people should feel safe in their own communities, and they have a right to feel safe, and people shouldn't commit crimes, whether they're adults or juveniles, against other people. And it's weird that I have to say that, but I feel like I have to say that because some people equate the notions that you both just said about taking care of kids and trying to help turn their lives around with lack of concern for public safety. And I just think we have to keep both of these concepts in our head at the same time. You can treat people decently and have a safer and more decent society. In fact, I'm not sure you can do the opposite of that. I'm not sure you can treat people indecently and have a safe society. Because I think when you start to treat people indecently, you lose legitimacy. And when you lose legitimacy, what you see is, you see the kind of case closure rates that we see in Baltimore. Case closure rates for shootings is under 25% in Baltimore. Imagine if someone shot you and you didn't go to the police. Why wouldn't you go to the police? Because the system lacks legitimacy in lots of parts of town. And so people would rather deal with it themselves than involve the system. And that's kind of gets really scary. I think the media contributes to that in a big way. I think it's a very cyclical thing. The media puts it out. It scares people. People then go to their elected officials with frightened policy suggestions. Politicians then talk about it, and the media amplifies it once again. When I was running my nonprofit, I did a study on the media's coverage of crime by people of color and by young people. And the findings showed gross exaggeration of crime overall. So I remember one of the findings was a 5-fold increase homicides on the ABC, NBC, and CBS evening news. This was in 2000 when Fox wasn't a big player. A five-fold increase during a time period when there was a 30% decline in homicides. So unless you were the victim of a homicide during that period of time, what the hell did you know, right? You thought that there was a huge increase in homicides, or unless you pick up the dull, statistics book that Nate and I read, right? And kids were wildly overrepresented as perpetrators of crime in the media. It was about 50-50, whereas kids were about 1 out of 14 crimes back then. And so when people were surveyed, they said, yeah, kids commit about half of all crime. And last year, there were 13 times as many adults arrested for homicides as kids in Maryland. You just never know that from watching TV. And so that's a bunch of statistics, and honest to goodness, sometimes when I say statistics like this, people think, oh man, I'm afraid because this guy doesn't think crime's a problem. I absolutely think crime's a problem. 44 of the kids on my caseload were shot or shot somebody last year. I got 1,500 kids in the community. I ran New York City probation with 30,000 people on my caseload. I didn't have 44 people get shot or shoot somebody. So we have a really legitimate gun problem in this city, in this state, in this country that we need to address. And certainly some people who do some bad things, including kids, need to be in custody. But if we think that little tail of who needs to be in custody is going to wag this big dog of improving public safety, just to really stretch my analogy, we're barking up the wrong tree.
So much was already said, but I think what is always important is to question the source of the information. So it's really important to attend forums such as this, really question where the information is coming from. And what is the source of that information? Is it really factually accurate? Is it true? We often see in the media and certain news stations in particular, what they're selling is the salacious, and that is what they're going to put out there. If you really pay attention, you will notice at times that what is being reported verbally may not necessarily match what you are actually seeing in terms of video. There are times where they are replaying the same video and perhaps telling a different story, but again, those images are constantly being played over and over again to build a certain type of bias so that next time you hear the story, it's automatically inflated, even though the story that's being related may not match the picture. And that is all part of the media feeding into individuals' fears. I think about a couple of weekends ago when there was a focus in terms of the number of arrests in Baltimore City. I think the number was about 200. And during that conversation, they focused on the fact that there were 18 juveniles that were detained and what were going to be about the juveniles. And I remember thinking to myself, well, what are we going to do about the 182 adults that were involved in whatever took place, right? When we think about these circumstances, it's really important in terms of the perspective and what is the source of information, and not let us be led, especially in this age of so many sources of information, social media, television, radio, all the things, not to simply be led in fear by what we are receiving.
Thank you, Natasha. And so I'm gonna pivot a little bit because I want to talk a bunch about what's sort of happening right now in the juvenile justice system. But I want to talk a little bit about what happens when young people are charged in the adult system, when children are charged as if they were adults. And this was one of the things that was addressed in the Juvenile Justice Reform Council in terms of recommendations, but Maryland, I think I didn't know this, in spite of working in juvenile justice for a long time, that Maryland has some of the very strictest laws when it comes to young people who commit more serious offenses, which again is not something that you would know from the news, but when young people are 16 or older, there is a very long list of offenses for which you are automatically charged as adults in court. And for even young people, 14 and 15-year-old, there is a shorter list, but also other charges for which young people are automatically charged in court. So I'm going to start, Gordon, with you. Like, you both introduced yourselves, Gordon, Willie, and spoke about being charged as an adult while you were a child here in this state. So I just wonder if you can talk a little bit about that experience as being a young person in the adult criminal justice system here in Maryland.
This is kind of emotional for me. As a 15-year-old, I was detained by the police. They didn't arrest me at the time, but not knowing any better, they did question me. They asked me, "Didn't I see you at the mall today? Didn't you have such and such on?" And I'm answering because that's what you're supposed to do with the authorities. That's what I was taught. I recall one of the sergeants saying, "Don't keep asking him questions because Miranda hasn't read him his rights yet." So I didn't understand what Miranda rights were, but I know Miranda never got around to tell me anything. So what ended up happening in that situation, because I said something and I told him, "Why did you," and I ended up talking, now there was information that could be used against me. Didn't know that. Not as an adult. I thought I was going to be treated like a juvenile. Also, clothing, any type of evidence, and then I was released in the custody of my parents several hours later. The next morning when I'm supposed to begin high school, the police come, 2 cars, and they raid my house. I ducked back in the woods because I'm not going home, I'm not going on a bus, but they checked the bus, they went to the homeroom class in school. I just knew my life was over at that point. Now, don't get me wrong, I do believe that sometimes you commit crimes, some children need to be incarcerated. I was one of those children, but I don't believe that I should have been incarcerated in the adult system. And that's the horrible thing which people really don't realize. I was incarcerated in 1979, before all of this big hoopla came about, right in the adult system with the men. Little 15-year-old kid, this small, can't fight, can't defend myself, and some of the things that you get subjected to will really drive you nuts. It really will. When I got my sentence, which was life, and went to the penitentiary, I couldn't even go in population because I was too young, and nobody would vouch for me. So I'm on administrative SAG. Eventually, it's like protective custody. But I ended up getting transferred to Patuxent. And I wouldn't admit my crime, so I didn't get accepted at Patuxent, but I developed relationships with some older guys. So when I got back to the penitentiary, they went to custody and vouched for me. And as long as I listened to them, the vultures stayed away. So for years, this pretty much worked. If I went on the basketball court, these older guys, my surrogate parents, used to kick me in the butt, beat me in the chest, all. Didn't I tell you, don't? Got me involved in school to get my GED, got me a job working in school as a college clerk. Didn't see this coming, but if you're a college clerk, you might as well go to college. They start doing things to really gear me towards trying to become better and to stay away from the people that were getting high and drunks and fights and that type of thing. But eventually, I got just as big as the other guys. I'm not the little kid anymore. And I became just as worse as everybody else. My first 5-6 years in prison, I was horrible. I was horrible because I had to fit in. I had to survive. And I did a lot of things that I'm not proud of today. What you see today is accumulation of 43 years in prison for the most part. A lot of intervention, a lot of help, a lot of assistance, but a lot of people I know that went in young, they didn't make it this far. They didn't. And I want to say that they did not make it this far.
Yeah, what Mr. Gordon, Mr. Pack said, I was fortunate as well when I entered the prison system at the age of 16 to have older individuals who took a liking to me. And this is not always the case. We are some of the rare people who experience this, because maybe 95% of the juveniles that enter prison, they become a victim in some type of way. And I call it survival coping skills, because if you can imagine going into an institution as a child, seeing these guys who are much bigger than you, stronger than you, wiser than you, to what goes on in the prison, you just look and you wonder how you want to survive. This is why that these institutions are not designed for children, because if you think of a child, they're going to be mentored, they're going to go to therapy, they're going to go to all these things that will help them with rehabilitation. But prisons are not designed that way. So my experience when I first came in, we talk about going on segregation or being isolated from the general population as a child. And this is another form of abuse, because you're isolated 23 hours a day. You come out for a shower, maybe a phone call, but you have no contact with basically anyone. So this is traumatic for a child. And you get there and you see all of these people moving around, and the first thing you think is, how am I going to survive this? And again, like I said, fortunately I have those who push me to education, getting vocational trades, but I was rare, and you've seen a lot of the young guys getting addicted to drugs, being sexually assaulted, being verbally abused, physically abused, and everything. So no matter what a child does, and I take this stand, I'm all about taking responsibility. I'm all about there being some type of punishment for breaking the law, but putting them into an adult institution, this should never be, this should never happen.
Thank you both for sharing, because it's a lot to share. And part of what you basically said is you both beat the odds. And I guess I want to turn to Natasha and ask you about what does it take to change the odds? Because, Maryland sends more young people to adult court based on a offense type and per capita than any other state other than Alabama. That's the state you all live in. Why do you think that is? Why this state? Why, where we live in Maryland, progressive Maryland here, why is it that we send more children to adult prisons than any place than, other than Alabama? And what do you, in your role defending children across the state, what do you think, what have you seen as the impact of this?
Gosh, that's really a weighty question. So I would start by saying Maryland overly relies on systematic involvement as well as carceral responses, especially when we're talking about addressing children of color. That is a fact. We know in terms of statistics, I believe it's 2020 or 2022, that black children were approximately 32% of the population, but in terms of referrals that were made to DJS, they were approximately 63%. Now, we talk about the crime bills of 1994, when especially black children were referred to as super predators, but in terms of Maryland, it goes back even further. We think about in 1902, especially in Baltimore City, where the age of majority was 16, and we had this shift in throughout Maryland to make the age of majority 18. We know in the 1940s is when the Juvenile Justice Acts were codified, and 18 became the age of majority. But it was not until 1945 that in Baltimore City that it was it shifted from 16, which it had been, to 18. So we know historically, especially in Maryland, especially in Baltimore City, a predominantly black city, where historically we have treated black children differently. And we continue to see the vestiges of that today in terms of our policies and how we relate to children. What is the impact? So you have children that come from marginalized communities being put into systems, especially children being treated as adults where they're not physically or mentally, psychologically mature. You have the impact that they're put into an adult system, and essentially they're going through the most important parts of their growth, but not being nurtured during that period of time. So you have citizens that aren't coming back into society, and essentially they do return to society without being nurtured, having received any type of mental health, without receiving a schooling. Because people fail to realize that despite what is lacking in DJS, there is zero in the adult system. So we're putting children in an adult system, and we're essentially locking them up, caging them with absolutely nothing. And that impacts not only the children, not only the families, but it impacts our communities. Essentially, what are we doing as a people? What are we creating? That has a negative impact on all of us. We often don't think about that. We just think about, okay, that particular person is removed from society, and then we forget about them. But essentially, after a period of time, what have we created? What do we continue to buy into? That has a negative impact on all of us.
So I want to follow that up with both Vinny, you, and Natasha. And so, you know, the Youth Equity and Safety Act, the YES Act, or some version of it, which would eliminate the practice of automatically charging children as adults. It wouldn't eliminate the ability to charge any kids as adults, but it would end the practice of automatically charging children as adults in Maryland. It's been proposed 13 times without passing. And the previous sponsor, Senator Jill Carter from Baltimore, has said she will not push the bill this year, presumably because it doesn't have a great prospect of being passed again. States like Missouri, Texas, Tennessee have passed laws to stop this practice. So I guess I asked the question again, why not Maryland? Like, what is it about our state that has stopped us from passing a law like this? Vinny, you want to take a shot?
I have no idea, but I really, I raised my kids in Tacoma Park and moved away for the last 14 years and then just moved back. I have nothing. Literally every year while I was gone, somebody was trying to get that passed. But I will tell you just a couple of things to amplify what was said. One is, in between running probation in New York City and running Rikers Island, I worked at Columbia University and I studied this issue and juvenile issues and was called as an expert in a lot of criminal cases. And in one of them, New York City had its age of majority, which is the age at which you're an adult, as 16, way longer than most other states did, until about 2016 was the year it changed. And so that meant if you were 16 or 17 and you got arrested, you were automatically an adult. You weren't even a child at all. And if you went to jail, you went to Rikers Island. So there was an adolescent unit on Rikers Island, and the last case I was on, the guy was my age, and when he was 16, which means when I was 16, he was in that unit. And I happened to find 5 people who were in that same adolescent unit with him to interview as part of my testimony. This guy wouldn't tell me what happened to him, so I had to use my imagination, but all the other guys told me what happened to them and what happened to people that they saw. And everything you guys said, you guys were tame in what you said. I mean, it was, I was talking to a jury and they were crying. And everybody was crying. It was 3 of the 5 guys cried on the phone with me. And several of them said they've never told anybody about this. They've been carrying this trauma around their entire lives. So I testified about that, but also about the research. There's been pretty good research on this. Florida, it's the discretion of the prosecutor to decide whether a kid is going to be tried as an adult. It's not automatic like it is here. The prosecutor gets to pick. So there are counties where it's wildly different, right? Some prosecutors do it all the time. Some prosecutors almost never do it. So the researchers were able to say, all right, well, what happens to a burglar kid that's accused of burglary here and a kid that's accused of burglary there, who's got no priors, who's 4 feet tall, and he's got long hair? You know what I mean? Like, they could really match kids up, hundreds and hundreds of kids. And what they found was that those young people, when they came out, that went to the adult system, got arrested more frequently for more violent offenses and more quickly when they came out. It makes you more violent. And that research was repeated over and over and over again. That research got told to the commission that you were on, right, the Juvenile Justice Reform Commission. The other thing that they told them, which is really not intuitive necessarily, the adult system has longer case processing times. The juvenile system, you gotta move the case pretty quick. But in the adult system, it can take months and months and months. So the kids stay 5, 6, 7 months, and then most of them, in my facilities, or in adult jails, depends on what the judge decides where to put them, they can go either way. And 87% of them never stay in the adult prison system. Their cases get dismissed, or they get returned to my system. So that's 6 months of dead time. Now, if you're an adult, and you get a 1-year sentence and you've done 6 months, you only got 6 months left minus whatever the good time is. If you're a juvenile, and you go to a placement, and it's gonna take 6 months or a year to rehabilitate you in that placement, you still got 6 months or a year to go when you've sat for 6 months. So that's dead time. Remember what 6 months was when you were 16 years old? Right? That's like forever. And so the kids are super frustrated, and you can't blame them. They're just doing dead time, and we spend tens of millions of dollars just waiting for them to be done. Money that if the YES Act passed, I could use for community-based programs. So there are a lot of principled reasons. 90% of the kids are kids of color that get tried as adults. It's bad public policy from the standpoint of repeat violent offense. But on a practical level, as an administrator, boy, I'd love to spend that money on programs and not on correctional facilities.
Did you want to?
So I would summarize as to why, and I would surmise, as to why the YES Act has not moved forward, and perhaps maybe in 3 wildly simple thoughts. So the first is essentially because of the failure to see Black children as children, and the inherent problem of not seeing Black people as human. I would put that out first. The second, in that we are, as people generally, reactionary and impulsive. So essentially, as opposed to basing our decisions in terms of fact, we are reactionary, and we're going to essentially respond to fear. So there's all this fear-mongering going on, and the response is we need to act now, as opposed to really pay attention to what the science tells us. And essentially, I think that the third part of it is a combination of all of that. Knowing what is best, but not having the courage to do what is right, even though we know what is best.
So we got at least 2 big topics I still want to hit. We have about 15 minutes, so we're gonna, but it's okay. We're gonna power through. We want to take questions too. So so after that, so I want to turn. We're going to talk about the Child Interrogation Protection Act in a second. And I really want to talk about it, especially because of your comments, Gordon. But first, I want to turn first to Vinny and just ask, like you said, tomorrow is your first 1-year anniversary. I'm sure it only felt like a year too. Yeah. So, now that you've had time to assess, like what are the biggest challenges and the biggest priorities for the department and for juvenile justice in Maryland. We have a room full of people who live here or experiencing this in their own communities. How can DJS improve public safety in Maryland and simultaneously protect young people in the juvenile justice system?
Great. So, as I said, I raised my kids here, lived in Silver Spring, Tacoma Park area, and so I was part of the advocacy community here before I got my job in the DC system, which was 2005. So from around 2000, 2005, I was advocating for better treatment for kids, and there were a lot of problems with the system back then, but there were programs all over the place. Maryland had a lot of good programs, both non-residential, youth service bureaus to divert kids, group homes, not perfect, but way more, a much richer array of stuff. When I got here, that stuff is gone. Like the last 10 years, there's been a serious disinvestment, and we have to kind of build that back up, and we have to build it back up at a time when the budget's lousy. And so that's really tragic. The department reduced in size substantially because juvenile crime did go down, television news notwithstanding. It really was a pretty substantial decline in juvenile crime. Like 25,000 referrals to my department. We call them referrals, but they're arrests. And otherwise, like also parents can refer or a school can refer. But most of that 25,000 are arrests. Last year, were like 12,000. So because of that sharp decline, the number of correctional facilities declined. But instead of reaping some of that and putting it into, community programs for kids, the department gave back $135 million over the last 10 years. So now I gotta sort of, like, you go to, and Baltimore's challenged, but you go to the Eastern Shore in Western Maryland, they're waiting months and months to get kids into drug treatment and mental health services. Baltimore's got issues too, but, so that's a big one for me. That's really big because, as Natasha said, part of what the courts have to decide on when they decide whether, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, because I'm not a lawyer, I just dress one, is this kid amenable to being in the juvenile system? And part of what they're asking themselves is, are there the kinds of programs that will help a young person like this when they decide whether that kid's going to be treated as a juvenile or as an adult? And we've lost a lot of those programs. So it's important to build them back up just because it's important, but it's also important because you don't want to sell those kids down the river because of our adult behavior and our adult failures. So that, to me, is a very, very big one. The other one is shootings. I mean, shootings just are tragic. There's been a 4-fold increase in the number of kids getting shot over the last 10 years. Kids are much more likely to be victimized by crime. Not only are they a small portion of the perpetrators, but they're an outsized portion of the victims. And a lot of the kids on my caseload are carrying guns to protect themselves from the other kids they think have guns. And so there's a whole bunch of them out there really not looking to do a bad thing, but then me and you are never gonna have a fist fight, right? Because I don't know if you got a gun, so I gotta pull my gun. And I'm not particularly good shot, so then they're gonna shoot you over there, right? So we've really, really focused on that. That was one of my big focuses for the first year, to start this program called the Thrive Academy. We got some data analysis by the Casey Foundation and this national group, the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, to help us forecast which kids were the most likely ones to be involved in gun violence. We hook them up with credible messengers, guys that have walked in their shoes, and they have what we call a suitcase for success. They can send a kid to college, they can get the kid a stipend, a job, or service to the community. They can move the kid and their family. We have the resources for all of that. They get them trauma therapy. I'm not meeting a lot of kids that are shooting guns that haven't seen some unspeakable stuff, right? So yes, it's bad for them to do that. I'm not saying it's not. And yes, we want to protect the community and don't want them to do that, but they've also seen or been the victims very often. I mean, they'll show you, they're shot, they're bullet holes. And so trauma therapy, and then just kind of normal kid stuff, camping, go to a ball game, go to a museum. So that's been a big priority, sort of focus on the kids that are in danger of being shot or shooting somebody. And then the facilities are kind of mediocre, solidly mediocre, punctuated by occasional badness. And I think there's been a lot of lethargy in them. And that's really challenging because it's a culture change thing and you just can't turn a boat. You know, it's an ocean liner, it's not a speedboat. But we're gonna surmount that one too. I had a terrible facility when I started in DC. When I left, it was a solidly good facility to help kids turn their lives around. So for the kids, some kids need to be confined for their safety and ours. And when that happens, you know, as a decent society, we need to treat them well and we need to help them turn their lives around. So those are kind of some of the answers to that.
You know, I want to, couple more questions, and I was going to start here with Natasha, but I really would like to turn to you, Gordon, and perhaps Willie. So in the same year that the Juvenile Justice Reform Act passed, the Children's Interrogation Protection Act passed. And it's a law that's pretty actually unique to Maryland and puts Maryland ahead of most states. It requires that when children are in police custody, that they're allowed to consult with an attorney before law enforcement can question them. And it passed last year, but now it's gotten a lot of pushback almost immediately from police and state's attorneys that they're pushing to repeal it. So I was going to start this way and say, why do you think that is? But I'd really like actually to start, Gordon, with you, if it's okay, because I think your story sort of touched on this and this specific issue of being a kid and not really understanding what it even means to have rights, Miranda rights. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about what, I know you've been advocating for SIPA, so I'm curious to get your take on this.
First, I believe SIPA was passed 22, not last year, I think it was 22. And the three primary prongs that were passed were one, and these things we take for granted. We just assume when the authorities detain a child that they notify the child's guardians or parents. Up until 22, they didn't do that. They didn't have a legal right. It wasn't mandated for them to do that, and that's something very significant. If you have a child that's arrested, you want to know what's taking place. So SIPA, that's one of the things they put out. You have to notify the guardians or parents that you have a child in your custody and what the circumstance is and where they are. The second thing it says that you have to read children the Miranda rights. Remember I said earlier about Miranda never read them up, but this is something that needs to be done because what they say can be used against them. And you have to explain it to a child in a way that they understand. But the third thing is, before you interrogate the child, you must contact an attorney and let the attorney consult with the child first. And that serves a great purpose because in reality we do all of these things to protect adults, Miranda rights, call people, you don't have to testify if you don't have to, but why should the rules be different for children and they're more vulnerable? Children are likely to say any and everything. And those things can be used against them, and they don't understand. They can be charged as adults and go to prison for a long time, or even a short time, and come home with a record and subject themselves to all types of horrible things and have a really difficult life. They don't understand that. So this is very important. The reason why the pushback is coming is because of the media, one, saying that these juvenile offenders are getting out of hand. We have to do something, have to be accountable. So the authorities are now saying that you tied my hands. We can't do anything about it because now I have to take the time to read them the Miranda rights. I have to call in at their parents though they are detained. I have to put them in touch with an attorney before I can even interrogate them. And they're not going to talk once they talk to an attorney. So they're saying we have to change this, go back to where it used to be so that we can start prosecuting and hold them accountable as you want. And I really don't think that's a good idea. And I don't think anybody that understands this situation would think it's a good idea too.
This is Mr. Pack said about interrogation as a child. When I was interrogated, I chose not to speak. And then, you know, they started talking, well, you're going to the adults. They drill you with so many things and lies. You don't know, like you said, you don't know about the Miranda. You don't know what they're telling you is true or not. And basically, they told me, they wrote down what occurred and asked me to sign. Basically, that's what happened to me. And I signed it. And you know, and I stood on it, whatever. So there was no attorney to tell me, let me review this, or don't sign your name here. I was impaired. I was out of PCP, and they put, are you under the influence of drugs? They put no. I put my name there, you know, and for years I tried to get, because they took urinalysis of me when I got went through the system, and for years I tried to get them to check the results of this urinalysis, and it never occurred. It was non-existent. So these are some of the things that is important to protect our children, because we believe that children needs to be protected when we talk about child protection laws, from being abused and mistreated and so on and so forth. So these same type of laws should apply to children who are being detained for a particular offense.
Thank you both. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll take questions. And
Could I just mention, Facebook people are having trouble hearing?
oh,
If you would hold the mic close.
okay. Thank you. We'll do that. So one more question, and Natasha, I want to throw it your way. So last year, you and Attorney General Anthony Brown created the Maryland Equitable Justice Collaborative. And the idea behind this, I'll let you talk more about it, but is that we have a deeply inequitable criminal justice system and some of the worst racial disparities in the entire country. So thinking about that the Child Interrogation Protection Act is under attack, that the Juvenile Justice Reform Act pieces that include restrictions on who can be detained, who can be incarcerated, restrictions on the minimum age of kids could be arrested. Lots of things are sort of being challenged and have been challenged in the media. I guess the basic question I have for you is, we're at the start of this legislative session, and there are a lot of things that are being challenged, and I guess what I want to know is, what would be the impact of going backwards on racial disparities? That the entire purpose of the, not to put you on the spot, but the entire purpose of the MEJC is to go in the other direction. It's acknowledging that we have horrific racial disparities in Maryland, and we need to reverse them. And the question I have is, what happens if we go back, re-roll back laws? What will it do to racial disparities in the juvenile justice system?
I really have a difficulty conceptualizing that, primarily because it is a situation where we cannot allow to exist. So it is a situation that not only the Office of the Public Defender, but we have so many partners in this fight that will not allow it to roll back. Even though we are in a defensive posture right now, we are continuing to fight and move forward. So essentially, you know, you're asking, what is it like to go back in time when a group of people were more oppressed than they are now? We would hope that we have advanced as a society and as a people, where at the very least we can hold fast to what advances that we've made and continue to progress. What we know from science and facts are essentially that we need to continue and progress. I did want to highlight a couple of things that were said. When we talk about the courts and how they look at children, and we speak about amenability, the focus needs to be, and we need to continue to emphasize that, the focus is this child amenable for treatment? And if the child is amenable for treatment, then the burden is not on the child anymore. The burden is on the systems and society that have created the situation of which the children are now bearing the burden of all the failings. So once we determine that the child is amenable, it is the responsibility of all the agencies and the systems to find the services, to create the services, to provide the services. it is not appropriate, nor should we be in a position to say, well, because a program doesn't exist, then we need to cage a child, or we need to place a child in an adult system. So first and foremost, I wanted to clarify that. The other part that is really important to emphasize is that children that are engaged in certain activities, almost 99.9% of the time are they themselves a victim of some sort of trauma or exist in an environment of extreme hardship and stress. I give the example of what occurred in Brooklyn homes. You have a situation where individuals were gathered for a block party, and just kind of out there having fun, and shootings. We have a community where we have to ask, what did we do to serve that community? What services were provided in terms of mental health, grief counseling, the normal things that we in this room would automatically be able to turn to? But perhaps because of resources or access to healthcare, whatever, certain communities don't have. So you've created a situation now where there's been a tragedy, we have not addressed it. And the reality is that the next party or whatever occurs, people are gonna wanna go and gather. And what are they gonna do? They're gonna feel the need to protect themselves. And now we have created a situation where there's perhaps individuals who may not have carried a weapon or something to protect themselves are now going to carry a weapon. And what happens when that particular child or young adult is detained? And we have to think about those situations and what we as a society continue to create. I would be remiss if I did not comment on SIPA and just really how nonsensical the argument that law enforcement is putting out, that simply because you cannot question a 15-year-old, then your investigation is over. Like every time I hear that, I'm like, are we for real? That your investigation is going to rise and fall on the confessions of a 15-year-old. Whereas perhaps if that's the case, maybe we need to pivot and do better investigations, better trainings, as opposed to the answer being that we're going to violate the basic due process rights that are guaranteed to everyone, regardless of age or socioeconomic background or color of your skin.
Amen. So we're going to take questions. I don't know how you, Evan, you want to?
Before I raise their hand, that I can bring one of the next.
Okay.
Thank you for this program. It's a very powerful testimony. Last year, I watched about 4 hours of the Yes Act testimony in the House Judiciary Committee. There were probably about a dozen or more people who testified in favor of the Yes Act. The only testimony against it was from 3 states' attorneys. Guess why they're testifying against it? Because they want to win their cases. There was no political courage on the part of our leadership in the House or the Senate, and I'm wondering where the governor is on this. And I really appreciate everything you're saying, but it's very frustrating. We were going to testify on behalf of the Yes Act this year. I understand why Jill Carter decided not to propose it again, and now we're trying to defend the Child Interrogation Protection Act. What is it going to take to force our leaders to have the political courage to do something about this? Because it's absolutely unacceptable in the state of Maryland. We think we're a progressive state. We're in the dark ages here.
Yeah, so, last year when the bill came up, the governor did allow us to speak in favor of it. And if it comes up again this year, I'll go back to the governor and we'll have that conversation. But he's never not supported it. It's got to start in the legislature. I will say, I see this here, this Take Action for Youth Justice in Maryland that Jews United for Justice put forward. They get to hear a lot, our elected officials, from people who are angry. And that's a powerful motivator for a lot of people. And I don't deny people the right to be angry. I've been mugged, I've been beaten up, my car's been stolen, my house has been broken into, and I was sexually molested when I was a little kid. And that sucks, right? It's a lousy thing to experience that, and people have the right to be angry. That shouldn't drive public policy, but sometimes it does. They actually need to hear sober people as well. So I would really take a look at this, and to the degree you all feel this way. I also would say, Rabbi, we need the religious community to kind of get organized and step up on us a little bit, because they're hearing from, just a handful of people can drive this. And I haven't heard much from ministers, from rabbis, from imams, about the need to take care of our children the way you expressed it today. That was really moving, the way you started today. And I know that others feel this way. I just think there needs to be a little more unity of message on it. I think it would help a lot.
The reality is there's a great number of individuals and communities that are in favor of the YES Act, that are in favor of treating children as children. But as was said, it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. And individuals who care, who understand, who believe in prevention as versus prison, really have to be more vocal, have to be present, and essentially have to contribute to organizations and individuals who are also making the same claims of prevention over prison and treating children as children.
As someone who testified last year and met with the senators and delegates, I can honestly say in one of these particular judiciary settings that I got thrown off, for lack of a better word. The testimony that I intended to make at the time didn't come out how it was supposed to be made, because it was so disheartening for me to see the senators, or was it delegates? But it was so hard for me to see the politicians saying, a 16-year-old shot someone? Going to juvenile service until he's 18 or 21 is not enough. They need to do more time. That was so disheartening for me that it just threw me off, because I had flashbacks. It took me back. Like, what? Just because of the crime, you mean that I can't buy a pack of cigarettes, I can't vote, I can't enter any contracts, but you said because I shot someone, because I used a gun in an armed robbery, that I should do adult time. And what's happening is that they are afraid. People are being hurt, the complaints are being made, and they feel like we have to be tougher to appease the public. And it's not the entire public that feels that way, but people have the right, as Mr. Charles said, to be angry.
So every once in a while I like to watch Fox News, because I kind of like a sense of what's going on the other side, if you will. And I happened to turn it on one night, and there was a segment about youth justice, and one of the people...
It's pretty much every night.
Fair enough. One of the people that they interviewed had a mantra of accountability, and that we need to hold kids accountable. And I know that for part of the public, being held accountable means you have to be charged with a crime and go into the juvenile system. I think that perhaps people might feel better if they had a better sense of, if we had this perfect world where kids were instead referred for youth services and got the services that they needed and deserved, how does that system wrap their arms around them and make sure that, you know, they move from point A to point B to point C and get what they really need, as opposed to, you know, the nightmare is they just get turned loose into the community?
So right now there's an imperfect graduated approach to this. And I say imperfect because it's a bunch of human beings. It's been, you know, budgets have been cut and all that stuff. But when kids come to us, we are actually allowed to divert them right out the front door. And we do for a pretty substantial number of kids. And 92% of the kids we divert, sometimes to programs, sometimes to write an apology letter, sometimes to have a face-to-face with their victims, sometimes to get detention in their high school. It depends on, there's a whole like range of low-end behavior that the kids commit. 92% of the time, they don't get reconvicted of a new crime within a year. So I want to make sure we don't fix that, because if we try to fix it, we could actually make it a lot worse. Because there's really good research that says that when you bring kids in and formalize their cases, they actually commit more crimes because they get systematized and they start to self-identify as people who are committing crimes. And so, again, my number one goal is to not have them commit crimes. And so 92% is, by government standards, a pretty good number that we're hitting. But yeah, no, I think there used to be youth service bureaus. The governor just gave us an additional $16 million this year, so we're gonna start funding like boys and girls clubs, places where kids can go so they don't get nothing at that low end of the system, but they also don't get systematized by us. But there's lots of things along the way that can happen. Sometimes we provide in-home family services to the family if the family is challenged. Sometimes it is a meeting with the person that they victimize. We usually call the victims. First of all, a whole bunch of them are victimless crimes. But when there are victims, we call the victims to get their input before we make that decision. That's the kind of more than half of the kids that are very low end, very first offender kids, because we get all of them. As you go up the chain and you get to the more sort of robust services like the Thrive Academy. But I don't mean to pretend to anybody that right now is a robust network all up and down that chain. There's a lot of holes, and depending on where you live, there can even be more holes.
I do want to make sure that we are grounded in this conversation when we talk about accountability, that children are not mini adults. And in the adult system, we tend to think about a crime in a particular period of time. When we talk about accountability and we're thinking about children, it's really important that we look at the child. So even though you may have a child who is physically 15, they may be mentally functioning at a reading level of an 8-year-old or have an IQ that is extremely low. So in terms of accountability, you really have to look at the child and the individual and make the punishment appropriate not only to the offense, but to the child. You think about, those of us who have children, right? When your 5-year-old, steals something versus when your 12-year-old steals something out of the refrigerator, you don't react the same, right? The way you react is really dependent upon not only how old the child is, their level of understanding, and also the time is appropriate to the child. So when we talk about accountability, it can't just be let's snatch them up and put them in a placement without really discussing that individual child and what the child needs.
Just briefly, when you talk about detaining children, and we say punish them, there has to be a balance of rehabilitation. When you look at a child being detained for a certain amount of time, he's going to spend a longer period of time in an institution than an adult would because of his age. So we have to balance detaining, punishing, and rehabilitation. There has to be some balance there. And when in adult institutions, rehabilitation for children is not a factor at all.
I wanted to ask about something that came up about the idea that it's just not long enough to only be able to detain someone until 21, and DJS only having jurisdiction until 21. And I don't know how it works in other states, but is there any push for extending the jurisdiction of the juvenile court beyond 21 so that kids who maybe do need a longer period of time for rehabilitation, maybe they would be amenable to treatment if a longer amount of time was available? could receive that within the juvenile system instead of going to adult court because they were 17 and maybe there's just not enough time between 17 and 21. Because otherwise you have these kids coming out when they're 21 and we all know that their brains aren't fully developed until a lot later than that.
So I would just start off by saying what the discussion is about time, especially from the state side. It is essentially a discussion because there hasn't been a placement. It's not necessarily a discussion that is from the perspective of the child needs more time to develop. So whenever you hear about extending time, especially from the state, it is a request so that they can get more time to do what is required of them.
So, I've looked at this issue around the country and around Europe, and there's sort of an interesting mix of experimentation that goes on with it. So Massachusetts, for example, allows kids to voluntarily stay in the system past their 21st birthday, and the system can provide the services. They can't violate the kid or do any of the carceral stuff that they would do, but they can continue services. That's much more common also in the child welfare systems because at 21, you think about your own kids that, like when they hit 21, are they ready to just go out there and get their own apartment and get a job and buy a car and all that stuff? And so child welfare kids aren't either. So there's some of that, it's voluntary. Some states do have longer, they allow kids to stay in them, either in the carceral part or in the aftercare part, and they have often done that in exchange for fewer of them getting tried as adults for exactly that reason. Sometimes judges just don't think you're 17 and you did X, up to 21 is not enough time. Despite what was said, it just doesn't feel like enough time for certain bad acts. And so some states and some countries have also done that. They've said, okay, for this specific type of stuff, which typically you get like murder or attempted murder, you typically get like these long adult sentences. We're going to allow some extended stays in the juvenile system. So you don't stay 20 years, but you stay an extra 4 years, and you come out and your record is protected because you still have confidentiality protections. There's mixed results from that, but that's not something I've ever heard discussed in Maryland.
Hi, I wanted just to make a comment as a reminder, and it's great that so many people are out tonight. A couple of reminders. One, Maryland is a former Confederate state. We're remembering talking about being blue. We're also in America. And the law enforcement community, which we haven't said much about tonight, as well as the state's attorneys, are very organized. They will be at every hearing. They will wait until 10 o'clock at night so they can talk to the senators afterwards. We have to be just as vigilant and hard behind and hard-headed to talk to them and make sure people hear what they need to hear. Thanks so much for y'all being here. Hi, Nate. Hi, Natasha.
Well, thanks so much. I'm afraid we're going to pivot now to, actually, it's a great segue to a call to action and how we can all take what we've learned tonight and act on it. So, Alan Johnson, talk to us about that.
My name is Alan Joff. I'm a member of Beth Am and a newly minted member of Jews United for Justice. First of all, I want to thank the panel. I thought this was really a terrific presentation, and I really appreciate it. I don't know whether it's fair to say maybe I'm preaching to the converted in the synagogue. I don't know if that's a okay metaphor or not. As Mr. Schiraldi suggested, well, there have been, as far as I know, there have already been 2 bills introduced in the legislature that are attempting to roll back some of the gains in juvenile justice reform that have happened over the last few years. And if we leave the room tonight and do nothing else, for a variety of reasons, some of which you've heard, those bills may succeed in being passed. So this is a call to action. We're asking everyone here tonight to commit to filling out one of these postcards that is being passed around that you can address to your delegate, senator, explaining why maintaining the youth justice reforms is so critical for all the reasons that we've heard tonight. And hopefully be calling on you in the future as things progress in the legislature. So thank you very much, and I hope all of you will follow through on the call to action.
Thanks so much, Alan. So if we want to take a few minutes, we have pens, and raise your hand if you need a pen or a postcard. It'd be great to be able to collect these, and we can mail them out for you. So let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll close out.
Will you get something to eat? Evan, will you provide the addresses if we put down the name of the legislator?
So on the sheets of paper on your table, you'll see that on the bottom part of the page is the names and the addresses of the leadership of the General Assembly.
Thank you.
You can also scan a QR code and find the information for your senators and your delegates. And if you want another postcard, you can find me or Molly or Evan, and we'd be happy to give you another one.
Hi, folks. If I could just have your attention for a moment. We're going to encourage you to keep writing in just a minute, but we wanted to formally wrap up the program and give people time to write. So my name is Rabbi Tyler Dratch. I'm one of the other rabbis here at Beth Am Synagogue. And I get to do another thing that rabbis do, which is thank a lot of people and express gratitude. So I first just want to thank all of the panelists, the Secretary Schiraldi, and Natasha Dartig, and Willie Hamilton, and Gordon Pack, and of course me. Not only do you educate us and help us do this advocacy work, but you shared your stories in vulnerable ways that help us be connected as a community of care around these issues. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. It's a gift that you give all of us. I want to thank a list of partners. I have an outdated flyer for this event. I know there were about 8 other logos that were added after this flyer. So to all of the synagogues and Repair the World and Jews United for Justice and organizations that came together to put this together, it's just an expression of the fact that we can only do this work across organizations, across lines of faith, race, and class. We have to come together. So this is just a small way that we need to keep doing this over and over again. And I want to thank Evan Serpent for putting together this panel for this event. We know at Beth Am that when Evan asks us to do something, the automatic answer is yes. So the last thing I want to say is that when I think about your words tonight, I'm inspired to work on this issue because I'm a rabbi, and one of the things that I'm asking myself to do in our community is to engage in a process that we call teshuvah,
which is the word that we use for accountability and return. Teshuvah literally means to come back. And when we stand together as a Jewish community on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we stand together to admit our wrong, to find out a way to repair the harm, and then to return to the best versions of ourselves and the best version of our community. It's clear tonight that we're a long way from that vision of Teshuvah in our state, and I hope that we will do the work this year. I'll definitely be in Annapolis. A lot of us will be. And on to really live out this vision of what we owe to each other and to ourselves, and especially to our children. I don't think we're going to solve it this year, but we'll all stay committed. So please keep writing. The last thing I was asked to say is that if you didn't sign in, if you can still sign in, because there's going to be more updates about this campaign and other work. If you have questions about the campaign, Eliana is standing in the back, and she's just here to, and others from JUFJ have answers to your questions. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you again to the panelists, and have a good night.